I can still remember the quiet weight of that night, the way the air inside my parents' living room felt heavier than it should have. I had come home carrying hope like a fragile box in my hands, believing that after all these years of working in silence someone would finally see me. My parents sat together on the couch, the same couch I had grown up beside, the same place where I used to study while Rosie rehearsed her routines for their praise. Even now, decades later, I can feel how my fingers trembled when I opened my laptop and placed my plans on the coffee table. The screen glowed against the dim room, casting a pale reflection of a woman who believed she had finally earned the right to be heard. I had spent 2 years building that prototype, saving every dollar I could manage, turning down dinners and distractions so I could keep the dream alive. When I looked at them that night, I wasn't asking for a miracle. I was asking for belief. $70,000 felt like a mountain I could not climb alone. But I thought just this once, maybe they would lend me a hand. I spoke slowly, calmly, walking them through the numbers, the commitments from early clients, the potential that was right there waiting. I watched their faces for the smallest shift, the slightest spark that told me they understood. It never came. My father lowered his newspaper with the same indifferent gesture I had seen my entire childhood, like he was folding away the last ounce of attention he had for me. My mother's expression barely changed. She rested her hand on her knee and gave me a look that held neither warmth nor interest, only the steady certainty of a decision already made. When my father finally spoke, his voice was flat, almost bored. It's too risky. Nothing more. No questions. No curiosity. No acknowledgement of the years I had poured into this dream. My mother echoed him, as if she had rehearsed the line ahead of time. You already have a stable job. You shouldn't gamble your life on something uncertain. Their words were gentle in tone, but they landed like stones. I closed my laptop slowly, careful not to let my disappointment show, because disappointment had never earned me anything in that house. Not comfort, not compassion, not even space to breathe. It is strange how silence can hurt more than anything spoken aloud. The quiet between us felt final. It felt like a door I had knocked on for years, only to discover it had never been unlocked. I sat there long enough to feel the room grow colder, long enough to understand that nothing I built, no matter how solid or promising, would ever be enough for them. When I left that night, I carried my laptop under my arm like a child I needed to protect. I walked through the hallway lined with family photos, most of them of Rosie in her bright dresses mid-performance, always smiling. I paused for a moment, looking at those images as if they could explain why the space between us had never belonged to me. But walls don't offer answers, and neither did they. I didn't cry on the flight back to San Jose. I held myself in a quiet discipline I had learned far too young. But inside something had shifted. Not anger, not yet. It was the first faint crack of something colder, clarity forming like frost on glass. A woman can spend a lifetime trying to prove her worth to people who never cared to see it. That night I realized just how long I had been doing that. Still, I didn't imagine what was coming. I didn't imagine the phone call months later, the one that would fold the truth open in a way I could never fold it back. I didn't imagine the excitement in my mother's voice, the way she could barely catch her breath as she described Rosie's newest dream. I didn't imagine the number that would follow. $725,000. A loan so large it echoed like a verdict. I didn't know all of that was waiting for me. All I knew that night was the simple weight of the words "too risky," spoken by the people who were meant to know me best. But sometimes life shows you its truest face not through harshness, but through contrast. And mine was coming, sharp and undeniable, carried by a voice on the other end of a phone I had not yet answered. When I look back at my childhood, I often think of it as a house filled with warm light that somehow never reached me. Our home in Austin seemed perfect from the outside, the kind of place neighbors admired and relatives praised. But perfection can be a thin film stretched over something much colder. Underneath that brightness lived a quiet imbalance, a slant in the way affection and attention flowed. I learned early that in our family love wasn't shared, it was directed. My younger sister Rosie arrived in the world like the sun itself. She sparkled, she danced, she demanded the center of every room without ever needing to ask. And my parents followed her glow as if it were their only source of light. I remember being a child and admiring her too, not out of jealousy but out of wonder. But admiration becomes something heavier when you start noticing how often you're asked to step aside so someone else can shine. I was the child who kept her voice soft, who obeyed without question, who did her homework at the kitchen table while Rosie practiced her twirls in the living room. My parents would often call out to her with pride in their voices, encouraging her, praising her, celebrating even her smallest efforts. I heard my name too, but usually in practical reminders: set the table, finish your reading, help your sister. The first real wound I remember came when I was 16. All I wanted that year was a small used car. Nothing fancy, just something reliable so I wouldn't have to stand at the bus stop in the Texas heat. I had saved articles, researched models, even found a few listings that were inexpensive. I approached my parents with hope, the kind of naive hope teenagers still carry because they haven't yet learned who will show up for them. They told me no. Not unkindly but firmly. They said I was responsible enough to manage without it, that public transportation built character, that a car was unnecessary. I tried to understand, tried to believe their reasoning, because children often accept their parents' words as truth. But then Rosie turned 16. The memory still feels like a scene from a play I wasn't meant to be part of. The backyard was decorated with strings of soft lights, the kind that sway in the evening breeze. Guests gathered, plates in their hands, laughter floating into the warm night. And then, with a flourish that felt theatrical, my father guided a brand new car down the driveway. A gleaming bow sat on the hood, catching the light like a promise. Everyone clapped and Rosie glowed. I clapped too because that was what I had learned to do, celebrate her, even when something inside me felt like it was folding in on itself. There were other moments, smaller on the surface but deeper in their cut. I once begged for $500 to attend a summer coding program. It wasn't a whim. I had researched every detail, explained how it could open doors for me, how it could shape my future. My mother listened, then shook her head gently. "You can learn all of this online," she said. "There's no need to waste money." 2 weeks later, Rosie boarded a flight to New York for a $12,000 acting camp. New luggage, new wardrobe, a celebratory dinner before the trip, and my parents speaking about her as if she were destined for greatness. No one asked what I dreamed of. These moments didn't break me outright. Children don't shatter all at once. They bend. They adjust. They learn where their place is expected to be. I learned to cook my own meals, to set my own routines, to handle my life without burdening anyone. If I came home proud, I learned to quiet that pride before it reached my lips. I still remember winning first place in a statewide science competition. I walked through the door holding my certificate with both hands, my heart trembling with accomplishment. Relatives filled the living room, leaning over Rosie's ballet photos spread across the table. My mother glanced at my certificate only for a second. "That's nice, honey," she murmured, before turning back to the group to describe the fabric of Rosie's newest costume. By evening, my award had slipped under a stack of magazines, hidden from view the way my achievements had always been. That was the beginning of my emotional conditioning. The slow, steady molding that teaches a child to make themselves smaller for the comfort of others. I learned to silence my excitement before it reached my voice. I learned to accept that effort did not guarantee recognition. And I learned that in my family, love did not move toward the child who worked the hardest. It moved toward the child who sparkled the brightest. But buried inside those years was something else, something I didn't understand until much later. A quiet shift. A hairline fracture in the story I had told myself about my family. It was the first crack in an illusion I had been carrying since childhood. The belief that if I just worked harder, behaved better, or stood a little straighter, one day they would finally see me. That crack would widen with time. And eventually it would break open the truth entirely. Growing up, I learned responsibility not as a virtue but as a necessity. It began quietly, almost without my noticing, in the small moments when I had to take care of things no one else thought about. By the time I reached my late teens, I had already become the person who packed her own lunches, managed her own deadlines, and handled disappointments with a steady calm I never learned from example. It was something I built out of habit, one quiet evening after another. I often watched Rosie float through those same years with a softness I sometimes envied. She seemed to move through life on a cushion of applause and reassurance. If she stumbled, hands reached out to steady her. If she dreamed, people gathered to enhance those dreams. I didn't resent her for it, not then. I only wondered what it might feel like to be caught when I fell. By the end of high school, I understood that whatever path I chose would have to be carried by my own strength. So I worked. I worked in ways that didn't make sense to most girls my age. While others filled their weekends with parties and escapes, I split mine between a grocery store, a tutoring job, and a part-time shift at a local cafe. I learned to manage exhaustion the way some people manage schedules. There were days when my feet ached and my shoulders burned, but each dollar I saved felt like a small promise I made to my future self. My parents noticed the work but not the weight behind it. To them, it was simply who I was. The responsible one, the one who wouldn't ask for more because she knew better. Responsibility became a role I didn't audition for but played with consistency. They trusted me to take care of myself even when I was still learning how. When I was accepted into a university on the other side of the country, I remember waiting for something, some sign that my parents felt proud or excited or even sentimental about my leaving. Instead, I was met with practical reminders about cost, rent, and how expensive groceries would be out there. I nodded through those conversations, though a small part of me hoped for a different kind of goodbye. There was no farewell party, no celebratory dinner, no visiting relatives crowding the living room with well wishes. When Rosie was accepted into an arts program that same year, I watched how the house filled with laughter and decorations, how everyone gathered to celebrate her next chapter. I don't think anyone meant to draw that contrast. It simply existed, like so many other quiet divisions in our lives. On the morning I left for university, my suitcases sat by the door while the house remained still. Rosie was still asleep. My mother handed me a small envelope with a list of meal prep ideas torn from a magazine. My father gave me a stiff nod, his version of encouragement. Then I walked out into the early light, carrying everything I owned and everything I had never received. The first year away was difficult in ways I hadn't expected. Independence looks admirable from afar, but up close it demands more than most people realize. I worked late shifts in the campus dining hall, then woke early to attend lectures, often with only a few hours of sleep in between. I stretched my scholarship and paychecks so tightly that even small indulgences had to be justified. I learned how to fix things instead of replacing them, how to cook meals that lasted several days, how to face loneliness without letting it swallow me. But something else was growing in those years too, something steady and strong. Every time I solved a problem on my own, every time I pushed through exhaustion to finish a project, every time I sat in a quiet room and steadied myself through fear, I felt a part of me harden into resilience. It wasn't the kind of resilience that shouts or demands to be admired. It was quieter, more deliberate, like a tree growing unseen beneath the soil. Those years shaped the foundation of who I would become. They taught me how to survive when support was scarce. They taught me how to move forward, even when the road felt uneven beneath my feet. They taught me that success, for some people, begins in silence long before anyone cares to notice it. I sometimes wondered whether my parents understood the effort behind my choices, or whether they saw my independence as a sign that I didn't need the same care they gave Rosie. But I never questioned whether I was building something meaningful. I could feel it in every long night and early morning, in every small sacrifice I made. Looking back now, from a distance of many years, I can see that those early experiences were laying the groundwork for a strength I would rely on far more than I ever expected. They were preparing me for the harsh decisions and painful realizations that waited just ahead. They were shaping me into the kind of woman who could stand alone when it mattered most. I didn't know then how important that strength would become. I didn't know how deeply I would need it. But it was already growing inside me, quiet and unwavering, long before the day my parents told me my dreams were too risky, and long before I discovered what they were willing to give someone else. There comes a point in every woman's life when the years of quiet effort finally begin to take shape. For me, it happened slowly, almost imperceptibly, during the long nights after classes ended and the world around me had gone still. I would sit at my small desk in my student apartment, the glow of my computer brushing against the walls, and work on an idea that had been tugging at me for months. An idea that would eventually become a working prototype, a promise of something greater than the life I had known. I didn't set out to build a company. I only wanted to solve a problem I saw everywhere around me. Construction teams were losing time and money because the systems they relied on were outdated. Information was scattered, communication was slow, and people were paying the price for inefficiency. I believed I could fix it, or at least try. So I saved, and saved, and saved. 2 years of living with a discipline that bordered on austerity. I turned down dinners, vacations, new clothes, even the little comforts most people don't think twice about. Every unnecessary dollar felt like a betrayal of the future I was building. I worked overtime whenever I could. I held on to my old laptop long after its battery began failing. My life became a cycle of work, study, code, and sleep. And strangely, I didn't resent it. For the first time, I felt like I was shaping something that mattered. When the prototype finally came alive under my hands, I felt a quiet triumph bloom inside me. Real companies, 8 of them, expressed interest. They told me they wanted to sign once the full product was ready. It was the first genuine validation I had ever received. Not from family, not from anyone who knew me, but from the world I was trying to build a place in. All I needed was $70,000 to move forward. It was a significant amount, more than I had ever imagined asking from anyone. But I thought, perhaps foolishly, that this time would be different. I had proof. I had numbers. I had something tangible. For the first time in my life, I believed I had earned the right to ask. I flew home that weekend with my laptop tucked safely in my carry-on, holding it as gently as one might hold a fragile photograph. I arrived at my parents' house with a practiced calm, rehearsing how I would speak, how I would present everything professionally, how I would make them see me not as the dependable child but as a woman with a real, promising vision. But the moment I sat across from them, I felt that old familiar imbalance settle around the room. My father kept reading his newspaper long after I began speaking, lowering it only when he felt forced to. My mother listened, but her eyes were distant, as if she were trying to understand something that didn't interest her. I walked them through the projections, the prototype, the commitments. I spoke with a confidence I had built over years of pushing through fear. And when I finished, I waited just for a second, for something soft to appear on their faces. Pride, recognition, curiosity, anything. But all I received was dismissal. "It's too risky," my father said, barely meeting my eyes. My mother nodded in agreement, her tone gentle yet final. "You have a stable job. You shouldn't gamble your future on this." Their words were familiar, but something inside me fractured anyway. Not because they doubted me, I had lived with that for years, but because they didn't even try to understand. The decision wasn't about the idea. It wasn't about the numbers. It was about me. They had already decided what I was capable of, long before I walked into the room. I left quietly, carrying my closed laptop like a burial. On the flight home, I stared out the window at the blank stretch of sky, trying to swallow the ache that kept rising in my chest. I told myself that disappointment was something I knew well enough to survive. But what happened next was not disappointment. It was revelation. A few months later, just after midnight, my phone rang. It was my mother, breathless with excitement. She didn't ask how I was or what I was working on. Instead, she launched into news about Rosie. "Your sister is starting a luxury event company," she said, her voice glowing. "We're helping her get everything set up." First, I didn't understand. Then she said the number. $725,000. A loan large enough to reshape a life. They had taken it without hesitation, without fear, without the caution they had wrapped so tightly around me. And not just the loan. A new BMW for her brand image. Designer wardrobes. A trendy office. Funds for launch parties. Everything that had been too extravagant, too impractical, too risky for me, suddenly became necessary for her. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My mother kept talking, her voice full of pride, describing Rosie's plans with a warmth I had never received for anything I had ever built. When the call ended, I sat for a long time in the dim light of my small apartment, staring at the wall as if the truth had carved itself into the paint. It wasn't just favoritism anymore. It was a verdict. A clear, undeniable statement of where I stood in the family I had spent my life trying to belong to. And in the stillness of that night, something inside me went quiet. Not anger. Not bitterness. Just clarity. The kind that dawns only when illusions finally break. There are moments in life when a woman realizes that the only person who will save her is herself. For me, that moment arrived quietly, almost without ceremony, in the days following my mother's excited call about Rosie's new company. I remember standing in the middle of my small apartment, the glow from my computer screen painting the room in soft blue, and feeling the truth settle inside me like a final steady breath. If I wanted a future, I would have to build it with my own hands. There would be no one to lean on, no soft place to fall. And strangely, the clarity felt calmer than the pain ever had. So I made the most difficult decision of my life. I mortgaged my tiny condo in San Jose. I can still recall the weight of the pen in my hand when I signed the documents. With each signature, I felt the last threads tying me to safety loosen. The condo had been my refuge, the one place in the world that felt fully mine. But I was offering it up in exchange for a vision that felt more real to me than any comfort I had ever known. The fear was sharp, but it was honest. It belonged to me, and for once that felt like strength. With the loan approved and my savings combined, I finally had enough to take the first real step toward bringing my product into the world. I rented a small office in an industrial building far from the polished streets of Silicon Valley. The walls were faded, the windows cracked, and the heater made a sound like it was carrying its final winter on its back. But when I stood inside that space, I felt a flicker of possibility. The kind that takes root even in the most unlikely soil. I hired 2 people who would become the backbone of those early days. Miguel, fresh out of college with bright ideas and a relentless work ethic, and Rachel, a woman whose warmth held our team together when everything else felt uncertain. The 3 of us sat around a dented thrift store table every morning, notebooks open, cups of cheap coffee steaming between us, building a dream none of us were sure would survive. And then the struggle began. The first few months were harsher than anything I had prepared myself for. We worked 18-hour days, surviving on sandwiches, instant noodles, and the faint hope that tomorrow might be better. Some days the software broke in ways I couldn't explain. Other days potential clients who had seemed eager simply stopped responding. Our funds drained faster than we could replenish them. And with each week, the pressure on my chest grew heavier. There was one night I will never forget. I sat alone in the office long after Miguel and Rachel had left, the only light coming from my monitor. The payment spreadsheet on the screen looked impossibly bare. A major construction company we had pinned our hopes on had backed out that afternoon with a brief, impersonal email that felt colder than the winter rain tapping against the window. The silence in the room was thick. I wondered if my parents had been right. If it truly had been too risky. If I had been foolish to think I could build something meaningful in a world that rewarded people who were handed opportunities, not the ones who clawed their way toward them. For the first time in years, a kind of emotional collapse washed over me. Not loud or dramatic, just a deep, quiet ache that settled into my bones. I lowered my head onto my arms and let the stillness hold me. In that moment, the weight of loneliness and exhaustion pressed down so heavily that I felt myself bending under it. But then, somewhere in the quiet, a different voice rose inside me. A voice that had been growing for years in the background of every disappointment. A voice shaped from the long nights, the early mornings, the childhood moments where I learned to stand alone. It reminded me of something simple and true. I had survived far worse than this. And I had done it without applause, without support, without anyone noticing. That realization steadied me. I sat up, wiped my face, and looked at the screen again. The numbers hadn't changed. The setbacks hadn't disappeared. But I felt something shift inside me. A quiet resilience rising stronger than the fear. And then just a few days later, hope came in the form of a single unexpected email. A construction company in Sacramento had heard about our prototype and wanted to try the software for a full year. It wasn't a massive contract, but it was real. It was steady. It was enough to keep the lights on and keep the dream alive. When we signed the agreement, Miguel brought in a $1 pizza. Rachel brought paper plates, and the 3 of us sat on the office floor laughing through our tears. It felt like breathing after holding my breath for months. For the first time since the beginning, I allowed myself to believe that we might make it. That the long nights, the sacrifices, the fear, they were shaping something far greater than failure. I didn't know then how much more the journey would ask of me. But I knew this much. I was becoming someone stronger than the girl who once waited for her parents' approval. I was becoming a woman who would stop waiting altogether. Success rarely arrives with fanfare. More often it slips quietly into your life, unnoticed at first, like a draft of warm air on a cold morning. That is how the rise of BuildFlow began. Not with dramatic victories or sudden breakthroughs, but with small steady steps that slowly reshaped the ground beneath my feet. After the Sacramento contract, everything shifted. Clients who had once hovered in uncertainty began to return my calls. Meetings that had felt one-sided now carried a cautious optimism. The prototype improved, bugs dissolved under long hours of work, and features that had once seemed impossible finally began to function smoothly. I watched the software take shape the way a gardener watches the first sprouts push through the soil, quietly, carefully, with equal parts relief and awe. Miguel and Rachel grew with the company too. Their confidence rose, their skills sharpened. Even on the hardest days, the atmosphere in our faded little office carried something warmer, as if the walls themselves had learned the language of possibility. We were under no illusion that the road ahead would be smooth, but for the first time, the path felt real under our feet. And while our world was rising, another world far away was beginning to unravel. I didn't hear about Rosie's company directly from my family. News has a way of traveling through unexpected cracks, and this time it came from old neighbors in Austin, people who still followed my parents' lives more closely than I ever had. The updates were subtle at first. Rosie missing payments on her storefront, suppliers complaining about invoices, clients canceling because events had gone poorly. It was a drip of information, slow and steady, until the truth formed like a shadow. Her luxury event company was failing. The loan that had once been spoken about with pride had become a burden that tightened its hold with each passing month. The BMW she had used as a brand image became too expensive to maintain, then too expensive to keep. Eventually, it was repossessed, silently taken from the driveway of the house where I had once lived. I didn't celebrate any of it. Failure is not something I would wish on anyone, not even someone who had been placed above me all my life. But there was a strange, almost painful clarity in realizing that the dream they had fought so hard to support had never been built on solid ground. It had been crafted from aspiration, not effort. From desire, not discipline. My parents tried to hold the pieces together. They refinanced their home. They took out smaller loans to cover the larger one. They shifted money from savings, retirement, anything with a balance they could reach. But the numbers never worked in their favor. What had once been confidence turned into fear. They were drowning, one unpaid bill at a time. And then the phone calls began. I still remember the first one. It came on a Thursday evening as I finished a meeting about new software features. My phone vibrated again and again until I finally answered. My mother's voice trembled in a way I had never heard before. She didn't start with pleasantries. She didn't ask how I was. She went straight to the truth. "Isla, we need your help." The next words came out in fragments, swallowed by panic. The bank was threatening to take the house. Payments were overdue. They were out of options. And then she said the amount. $100,000. The number settled in my chest like a weight made of stone. It was money I had saved through sleepless nights, through sacrifices no one had noticed, through labor that had taken years off my youth. Before I could respond, my father's voice replaced hers on the line. "You're successful now," he said, as if my success had been a given, not something carved from the kind of loneliness they never saw. "We raised you. We invested in you. It's time you repay the family. Sell your home if you need to." Those last words wrapped tightly around my breath. Sell your home. The home I had mortgaged to build the life I now stood in. The home that had held me through every failure, every quiet victory, every moment of self-repair. To them, it was simply an asset, something disposable. I swallowed hard. "Dad, I can't. That condo is everything I built when I had nothing else." There was silence. Then a sigh heavy with disappointment. "So you're choosing yourself over your family." I closed my eyes. The accusation was familiar. An old wound reopened. But this time the hurt didn't wash over me the way it once had. There was a steadiness inside me. A certainty formed from years of standing alone. "I'm choosing fairness," I said softly. "Something I never received." My mother began to cry. My father muttered about ingratitude. Their voices tangled together until I quietly ended the call, unwilling to let guilt pull me back into the shadows I had spent my entire life crawling out of. The calls didn't stop. The messages didn't stop. Even Rosie sent long, emotional paragraphs accusing me of selfishness. But beneath all their pleas, I felt a shift inside myself. A line had been drawn, not in anger but in self-respect. I had spent a lifetime giving more than I received. They were asking for something I could no longer surrender. And I knew this chapter was far from over. There are moments in life when the past arrives at your doorstep, uninvited and unprepared for the person you have become. The day my parents and Rosie showed up at my condo in San Jose was one of those moments. I remember the doorbell echoing through the quiet afternoon, sharp and hurried, an urgency that didn't belong to the peaceful space I had worked so hard to build. When I opened the door, they were standing there, my father with his stern expression, my mother with a tired kind of sadness in her eyes, and Rosie with her arms crossed, wearing the familiar look of someone who believed the world owed her a gentler landing. For a moment we simply stared at one another, the distance between us filled with years of unspoken truths. "We need to talk," my father said, brushing past me before I could invite him in. My mother followed, her gaze drifting around the condo as if measuring its worth. Rosie stepped inside next, her presence carrying the faint air of someone who still expected applause where none existed. I closed the door behind them and remained standing across the room, choosing not to sit. I needed the firmness of my own posture. For a few seconds no one spoke. Then my mother broke the silence. Her voice was soft, almost pleading. "Isla, what happened with Rosie's company wasn't her fault. The market changed. She just needs some time. We all do." I didn't respond. I let the stillness settle. My father leaned forward, impatience tightening his jaw. "You have the ability to help. We're not asking for luxury. We're asking you to sell this place and use the money to save your family." Rosie's voice slipped in next, thin but sharp. "You know I didn't mean for things to fall apart. You're doing well now. Why can't you do something for us just once? Just once." The phrase settled over me like a shadow, almost laughably untrue. For a lifetime, I had carried the weight of responsibility, while she had carried nothing but expectation. But I kept my voice even, my calm a deliberate choice. "For once," I said slowly. "Rosie, you've been given everything: cars, camp support, a $725,000 loan. When I asked for $70,000 after years of saving and building, I was told my dream was too risky. Tell me, what exactly makes this different?" Rosie opened her mouth, but no answer came out. Her silence said more than her words ever could. My father stepped in before she could recover. "We believed in her dream," he said firmly. "She needed help. And I didn't?" The question came out calm, but the room seemed to hold its breath. When I presented my prototype, I had clients ready to sign. I had numbers. I had a plan. Everything you taught me about responsibility, I lived it. But you dismissed me without a thought. You didn't even look at the work I brought home. You didn't ask a single question. I paused, letting the truth settle between us. You said it was too risky. Yet you borrowed more than 10 times that amount for her without hesitation. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "We didn't want you to struggle." I held her gaze. "I struggled anyway." The room grew painfully silent. The kind of silence that reveals everything people try to hide. My father shifted in his seat, the weight of the moment pressing into him. "You've always taken care of yourself," he said finally. "We trusted you to manage." I nodded once. "That's exactly the difference. You trusted me to survive alone. You trusted her to be rescued no matter the cost." Rosie huffed, frustration cracking her composure. "You're being dramatic. This is family. Families help each other." I looked at her with a quiet sadness. Families also respect effort. They acknowledge sacrifice. They don't ask one child to destroy the only thing she built just to repair the choices of another. My father's voice hardened. "So this is how it ends? You're willing to let us lose everything?" His words hit me, but not the way he intended. For a moment I saw fear in his eyes, a fear of losing the house, their stability, the image they had upheld for years. But I also remembered who I had been forced to become. I remembered coding until dawn, rationing groceries, using my condo as collateral for a dream no one believed in but me. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. "I'm sorry you're struggling, but I am not selling my home." My mother's cry filled the room. Rosie scoffed, shaking her head. My father stood abruptly as if he could intimidate me into surrender. "You'll regret this," he said sharply. I walked to the front door, opened it and stepped aside. I have spent a lifetime regretting things that were never mine to carry. They hesitated, perhaps waiting for me to take the words back, to soften, to return to the girl who adjusted herself to keep the peace. But that girl no longer existed. One by one they walked past me. My mother paused in the doorway, hope flickering in her eyes for a version of me she believed she could still reach. But I did not apologize. I did not explain. I simply closed the door. The soft click echoed through the quiet condo, a sound that felt like both an ending and a beginning. I leaned against the wood for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. Tears gathered, fell, and then stopped, not because I wasn't hurting, but because I had finally chosen myself. And choosing myself didn't feel selfish. It felt necessary. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. After the door closed behind my parents that afternoon, the storm that had lived inside me for years finally began to settle. I didn't cut them off. I didn't change my number or block their calls. I simply stopped participating in the patterns that had once defined my life. And without my participation, the patterns dissolved on their own. The calls slowed. The messages grew shorter. Then one day they stopped altogether. From a distance, news still reached me. The red brick house I had grown up in was first refinanced, then mortgaged again, and eventually listed for sale. My father withdrew from his retirement early. My mother spent more time at church, seeking comfort from a place she had rarely needed before. Rosie moved in with her boyfriend and tried to curate her life online, as if nothing had collapsed behind the scenes. Her pictures showed bright smiles, but the light in them never reached her eyes. I didn't take pleasure in any of it. I didn't hope for their downfall. I simply recognized the truth I had never been allowed to admit. Consequences arrive whether we invite them or not. 4 years they had built their world on imbalance, on rescue, indulgence, and denial. When that world cracked, it did so along the lines that had always been weakest. By contrast, my own life grew steadier. Build flow expanded slowly but surely. We signed long-term clients, hired new team members, moved into a brighter office filled with warm light and the quiet hum of productivity. Some days I would walk through the space, listening to the soft rhythm of keyboards and conversations, and feel a gratitude so deep it felt like breath filling new lungs. With the company stable, I moved out of my tiny condo and into a small rental house in Palo Alto. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't meant to be. It was peaceful. The yard had a narrow garden where lavender grew along the fence, and in the evenings the air carried the faint scent of eucalyptus from the trees down the street. For the first time in my life, I felt anchored in a way that didn't rely on anyone else's approval. My mornings became quiet rituals. Coffee steaming in my hands, sunlight drifting through the kitchen window, the sound of distant birds cutting through the stillness. Evenings were spent walking through the neighborhood or sitting in the garden, watching the sky soften into shades of gold and violet. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It rarely does. It came in small moments, when I realized I no longer flinched at unexpected calls, when I caught myself smiling for no particular reason, when I understood that peace wasn't something others could give to me. It was something I had grown on my own, piece by fragile piece. I often reflected on the long road that had brought me here. The years of being overlooked, the relentless work, the quiet collapses, the bold rebuilds, the final boundary. It all felt like chapters written by a younger woman who had no idea how strong she would become. One evening, sitting in the garden with the last traces of daylight resting on my shoulders, I understood something I wish I could tell every woman who has ever felt invisible. Choosing yourself is not abandonment. It is alignment. It is the moment you decide that your worth no longer depends on someone else's recognition. I had spent a lifetime believing that family was defined by obligation, sacrifice, and silent endurance. But the truth is far gentler than that. Family, real family, is built on mutual respect, shared effort, and the willingness to see one another clearly. When those things disappear, what remains is not love. It is habit, and habits can be broken. Now, when I look back on the night my parents told me my dream was too risky, it no longer carries the same sting. It feels like a turning point, a quiet invitation to step out of the shadows and into the life I was meant to build. I once thought revenge would feel like fire, something bright and burning, but in the end it felt like light, soft and steady, illuminating the path I had walked alone and showing me how far I had come. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who understands quiet strength. Sometimes healing isn't loud. It's the courage to begin again. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your stories matter here.